Well, hello and a very warm welcome to today's BA Community webinar. I should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. My name is Adrian Reed, and I'm really pleased today to be joined by Raafat Zaini. We're going to be discussing a topic today that well, you may or may not have heard of, you may or may not have thought about before, but the more I've read about this topic and the more I've spoken to Rafat, the more I'm convinced that for what we do as business analysts, it's really absolutely crucial. So the title of the session today, as you will have seen, is Cultivating Dissent, Why Ensuring Voices are Heard is Hard. And perhaps in your practice as a BA, you've tried to get people to dissent, to, critique and to speak up. Perhaps you've even found yourself in a situation where you have tried to speak up in an organization that has has said that it wants dissent, but maybe you found the organization doesn't really want the dissent when you actually speak up. So before we get started, a little bit about Rafat. So Rafat is a research scientist at the Social Science and Policy Studies Department at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. He's published research in modeling dynamics, systems spans, organizational design, dissent change, strategy, and cognitive learning. He reviews for academic journals and conferences, has more than 20 years of industry experience, holds a bachelor's in mechanical engineering, a master's in aeronautical and industrial engineering, and a PhD in systems dynamics and organizational behavior, which is just fantastic. And those of you that know me know that I'm very much enjoy systems thinking and systems dynamics. So Rafat, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Adrian, for having me, and thank you for the audience who joined us today.
Absolutely. So just before we get started, Rafat, one thing I should say to those listening in is that you can ask questions. So if you hit the Q&A tab, you can ask questions, and we'll cover as many of those questions as we can throughout the session. Those of you that have attended a webinar before will also know that what we do is we create a shared workspace, in this case, a mural. And I'm just going to share my screen very briefly to show you. So you'll be seeing now my desktop, which is a mural board. And if you're tuning in live, you could perhaps contribute to some collective note-taking. So all you would need to do is perhaps when Rafat says something that is of particular interest to you, you just double-click and you can make a note. And then you can make it different colors, you can play around with it. And then about halfway through, we'll see what notes you've taken. And then there's also a sort of artifact for all of us to take away after the session as well. So with that in mind, I guess a good place to start, Rafat, is many people tuning in might not have heard of the term dissent in a business context. So what is it and why is it so important? And are you able to give an example of what dissent looks like?
Sure. Because up to a few years ago, I did not encounter that term before. I may have heard it in different contexts, but just discovering it and knowing about it was an aha moment to me. So dissent is simply expressing one's different opinion, and especially when the majority have a different one, and that in particular what makes dissent a bit different from other forms of expressions of opinion. An example could be, and we can imagine this, people are meeting in a boardroom or in a meeting room, and where everybody is upbeat about an idea, and just someone says, "Man, might not be a good idea," or they discover a hole or a fault in that idea, and they just openly express why they think that this might not work. And you can imagine it's probably 5 minutes before the end of the meeting, and everybody's upbeat, and somebody's just speaking through and saying this. So that's the simplest dissent example I can provide. There are numerous other ones, but that's one.
So if I understand correctly, Rafat, it's about an individual questioning or having a different opinion or having concerns and expressing those concerns. So does it follow then that that dissent can be quite open and transparent, or it can be a little bit what we might call tacit, I suppose? So for example, the person sort of going, meh, that's perhaps more tacit than someone actively standing up and saying, I think that's wrong. So there's maybe a sort of spectrum of dissent.
Yeah, and it really depends on the culture of that organization. If people feel that they will be accepted for their opinion, no matter what the opinion is, they probably be more upfront about it. And one thing we need to know also, it's also depending on people's style of expression. There are people who are direct and those who are indirect. And there are people who calculate every step before they take a stand, and there are people who just simply cannot, and they will just voice it as it is. So there are different manifestations. One depends on the people themselves, and some depend on the organizational culture and climate that surrounds that person. So they can take different forms.
Interesting. And one thing I know from reading your research is you show how bringing in professional management, and I think the example or the subject of your study was universities, but how that can lead to short-term focus at the expense of the long-term. And I'm sure many people listening in will recognize this short-term focus. I know I've certainly, I recognize that from some organizations I've had experience with, even if they happen to be in a different domain. So how would you say that short-termism affects dissent?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Adrian. Dissent by its nature requires time, because to be able to listen and debate and ask questions and inquire about the nature of dissent and processing it definitely will require time. And if people are pressed in time to deliver, and if their KPIs ask them to go for a quarterly reviews or results, and they see the weeks or the days or hours flow between stand between what they want to accomplish and someone who is coming with this idea, it definitely puts pressure, and it makes dissent harder to accept and process, and that could be a huge challenge. So the short-termism by its nature will definitely be in opposition to dissent that requires time. And it really depends how do we calculate the time, because sometimes we might need to repeat things. And if we calculate that time and compare it with the time we invest in processing dissent, well, it might end up allowing dissent to be the path that could take us to success. But if you are measured with a short period of time, you will be just focused on what needs to be done now. And especially with middle management, they are torn into between the top management and between the people they work for, because they have to deliver quickly. And with the change of leadership, everybody wants to do it now and do it correctly. And that puts a huge pressure on people.
Yeah, as you were speaking there, Rafa, I was thinking about the challenge that publicly listed companies have, where they've got shareholders who are demanding quarterly returns or quarterly updates, and that changes the dynamic. It makes it hard, because actually what's good for the long term can mean that you've actually got to accept a short-term pain. And it sounds like there's a parallel with what you're saying there, Rafat, because actually the dissent might mean that there's got to be some short-term pain in perhaps recalibrating the direction of a project, a program, or even a product line or an organization. But that may save the organization long term, because it might mean that it doesn't, milk the cash cow dry, to use a cliche.
Yeah. And that's why you can see, even in publicly listed companies, there's some companies don't pay attention to the quarterly calls.
Yeah.
And even the CEO doesn't address them. It just sends a signal that this is not something that we manage our organization by, but we'll have to do it because it's a requirement, but it's not because we believe that it's the real measure of the organizational performance in terms of reporting, when to report, and why.
Yeah, absolutely. So dissent as a term might sound, or some people might argue that dissent sounds like quite a negative term. Would you say it's about criticizing things and sort of pulling things apart?
Yeah, we definitely can think about it as criticizing and pulling things apart, but only pulling things apart only to rebuild them in a better way. And I mean, we do this all the time when we discover mistakes. And it's better to discover mistakes early on before investing hugely in projects or products or ideas, and be able to correct the path. So, and how to correct the path? Correcting the path always means changing direction. Even it doesn't mean 180 degrees, but it could be a small nudge that could save an organization a huge amount of losses in terms of, and losses doesn't need to be monetary. It could be reputation. It could be knowledge that is lost. It could be good people who could be also lost to competitors or to somebody else. So it's the definition of loss, and it's the definition of taking things apart that makes a big difference on how our perception of dissent is. So that's how we view it. And if we just change the way we look at it, we might be able to embrace it.
Yeah, and as you were talking there, I was thinking about one well-known author, and this might be a set of techniques that perhaps bridge the two worlds, the business analysis and other worlds, is De Bono and De Bono's thinking hats. Because I'm a fan of the Thinking Hats book. It's a very, very easy very accessible read. And if I remember correctly, De Bono talks about parallel thinking. So getting a group of people to simultaneously think in the same way. And I suppose, is there an argument that like the black hat, De Bono's black hat, is like the dissent hat, and actually maybe techniques like De Bono's thinking hats are a way of ritualizing that dissent to get it out on the table in a more systematic way.
Exactly. Yes, that's well said. Unfortunately, some people use the thinking hats not by allowing themselves to all be thinking about the negative sides of things and identifying them. They distribute roles. So they said, yeah, you were the black hat because you're good at it. But in fact, we all have to be good at it, because if we became good at it, we will be more accepting and embracing. But if we attach it as a label to someone, which sometimes we call them the devil advocates, and it's just like keeping the place where everybody throws their trash and say, hey, let's look at this guy, what else he might find. And over time, it becomes stigmatized by making that label. So there will be the creative guy, and there will be the negative guy, or those who look at the negative parts. And that's not healthy for the organization. But having the discipline to apply this thinking hats is tremendous, despite how easy they seem to be. So allowing the concept of dissent to be there, to be part of the conversation, is a gain that even those who don't know the de Bono's thinking hats might benefit from this. So I totally agree with you that de Bono is making it as a systemic way of approaching topics, and that's a great thing to have.
Yeah, definitely. And I was smiling when you were mentioning the idea of a stigmatized individual who's seen as the blocker, because that, I think, is sometimes, it's interesting. I know as a business analyst, we often have that, or I speak for myself, often, you know, I might be the one dissenting, but when you dissent regularly, you get seen as almost like the innovation prevention person. And whereas that's not what I want to do. I just want to make sure that things are done in a very calculated, informed way. So I really love that idea of spreading the dissent, of making it everyone's responsibility, everyone's empowered, and everyone's expected to you know, respectfully challenge in that way, which sort of bridges to my next question, which is, a lot of this sounds cultural, and I wondered, what would you think, Rafat, are the conditions that need to exist in an organization so that people actually can dissent?
So dissent is always there, as long as there are people, because people have different opinions, they have different motives. The question is, you want to make dissent visible, and the worst that can happen is for dissent to become invisible. If the leaders of organizations just realize this simple fact, they won't be happy in a room where everybody is silent. You know, they should rather, it's a good problem to have, to manage a room where everybody speaks out, rather than a room which is full of silent people, like silent and don't say anything. Although it makes meetings shorter, makes consensus easier, and makes everybody feels happy and they leave to do their thing, but it's a bad indication. So the thing that needs to happen is that making it safe for people to speak up is something that needs to happen, but it's not enough, because people needs to be encouraged to speak up, because it's an asymmetrical relationship. It's easier to be silent because it's safer. It helps short-term gains because nobody will attack you, and you know, you can. It's a self-preservation technique, if you will, to just keep going and not to be noticed. If you put yourself out, even if your dissenting ideas might be wrong, you can go into explore territory.
Yeah.
So encouraging people is important. That's my point.
Absolutely, and it is interesting, isn't it? Because I know that some organizations almost seem to have a culture of, you know, keep quiet, keep your head down, do what you're told, and you know, and you'll be rewarded in the long run. You know, that's how the hierarchy seems to work, very, very top down. But Marcus asks a really interesting question, which is, he asks, are you describing healthy dissent versus the contrary? And that's a question I hadn't really thought about. Is there such thing as healthy dissent and almost like unhelpful or unhealthy dissent?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. And those who write about dissent, and I cite here Jeffrey Kassing, who has a nice book called Dissent in Organizations. It's actually a very good read, and it summarizes years of research in that book. I highly recommend reading that book. It talks about dissent, they call it disciplined dissent and undisciplined dissent, where dissent takes more of a personal flavor rather than a dissent that looks at the benefit of the organization. But there are ways to improve dissent and keep it focused, which is the next thing to be in an organization is how to manage dissent. Managing dissent doesn't necessarily mean control it, but first of all, engage with those who dissent, process their dissent, and processing their dissent doesn't mean agreeing. Processing dissent is engaging, and not only to make like an open inbox for people to express their views and never to look at it because they will just be silent and quiet and never do it again, but also to improve the expectations from dissent. When you seek dissent, you're asking people to focus on a topic. You're not making it like a playground for everybody just to throw anything. You can ask for specific dissent in how to express it. Do you want it to be expressed in writing? Do you want it to be expressed in verbal format? Do you want to have it synchronous, asynchronous, online, offline? These are all channels, but most importantly, to act on them. So if there is a proliferation of undisciplined dissent, this is a symptom of another illness in the organization. So what we're talking about is definitely the disciplined dissent, where people are looking into something that goes beyond their immediate needs. But it could happen as well, but it doesn't mean that that's a bad dissent. It means that there is deeper problem that needs to be discovered.
Yeah, it's interesting because again, as you were talking there, Rafat, I was imagining certainly some organizations I've known do have like almost suggestion boxes or like fresh ideas submission, but they're just like black holes of and what happens is you just get people who have an axe to grind, people who have a particular, it may be valid, but it's a vocal minority expressing a vocal minority view, which is not necessarily unimportant, but it's not representative. So I suppose part of that is about democratizing that, and as you say, encouraging people so that you get a range of dissenting voices, so that those range of dissenting voices can be processed and considered and actioned accordingly.
Yeah, there is a tricky part though. On a short term, encouraging people and making more channels for dissent without providing the capacity to process dissent, it could lead to a short-term gain of engagement, but over time, because people perception about their organization that there is tolerance for dissent. But if there is no response, then lack of responsiveness would take people to go back into being cynical and quiet. So it's a very delicate balance between providing ways for seeking input, and just accumulating dissent is not helpful. It causes people to be more resentful.
Yeah. And again, that's another pattern I've seen, which is the sort of, well, there's no point in speaking up because you'll get a thank you email and nothing will ever change. Or even worse, you'll just get a justification of the status quo. So, you can raise anything you want, but someone will just twist your words and explain to you why you're wrong, which is perhaps a lack of capacity or willingness to actually engage with the dissent. So as business analysts, and I know a lot of people tuned in will be business analysts. I'm certainly a BA. We're often said to influence without authority. So we will liaise with senior decision makers, even though we're not typically senior decision makers ourselves. Are there any tangible ways you would suggest that we can build dissent into our projects and initiatives? So even though we don't have the authority to initiate, organizational wide changes, can we nudge people and projects and programs towards dissent?
Yeah, definitely. And that's actually one of the practical ways of implementing or embracing dissent. It doesn't need to be only about encouragement, but if people are encouraged to share their work in progress early on, seeking genuine feedback before getting attached to the piece of work that they're working on, this provides a very good receptive environment to dissenting voices, because there's not a huge investment, and it's a practical way of soliciting dissent because there is not much buildup that people could lose. Because we have to consider that it's always a two-way between the dissenter and those who receive dissent. Even dissenters might sometime start thinking, you know what, maybe I should be quiet. This guy have already spent so much into doing this. Shall I talk now and just, rain in his parade day? Or just let it go and see what would happen? And, this is very contagious. People could look at each other and shrug because, this guy is in a very celebratory mood. Why would we ruin his day? Especially if he's the first guy in line presenting and the second one is just waiting for his turn, So encouraging people to be open about sharing incomplete work and receiving feedback, that's a very practical way of creating that safety. And I think this is easy to apply without going into thinking deeply about what else we need to do about dissent.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that reminds me a lot of one thing that's considered a very useful practice in the sort of work that certainly that I do as a BA, which is peer review of work. But early and regular peer review, both formally and informally, which is just the person I'm working with, look, can you just take a quick look at this? Because I know there's things I've missed, but tell me what they are before I've spent too much work on it. So I suppose there's the element of formally building those things into a process, and also encouraging those informal touch points where it's just, ring the person up on the phone and ask them to take a 10-minute look and give you that opinion. And I like what really resonated with me there, Rafat, was the do it early, do it before there's too much time. And sometimes it's interesting, isn't it? Sometimes after time, there's political capital in something. So it almost can't change. Even if it's wrong, it can't change because someone's bet their career on it.
Yeah. And we know in project management that a huge chunk of cost is actually committed to at the beginning of a project by the choices made at the early stages of project. So if we allow that period to be a time for dissenting views, then that's the time where the most savings happen. And I think in academia, this is hardwired. Dissent is by design. That's why academics don't get their value from their bosses or from the acceptance of the higher-ups. They get it from the peer reviews.
Yeah.
So they write white papers, they share proposals, they go to conferences until a paper is published. That's a lot of barriers to go through and get hit by people who are thinking your work, is worthless. Yeah. Only to be maybe a Nobel Prize at some point. I know that business doesn't have the luxury of that timeline. However, things can be scaled down, depending on the frequency. Academia does have time, but who said that you can make that time in days or weeks rather than months or years? It just changed.
Absolutely. And one of the things which you said earlier is actually by having early dissent, that might mean that, you know, the time and money is saved in the long run because something sets out in the right direction versus the wrong direction. And an expression that I heard someone say years ago in an organization was, oh, we can never find the time to do something properly, so we always find the time to do it twice. And I just thought, yeah, that's so true. And maybe having dissent, particularly early, helps us avoid having to do something twice.
Yeah, this is if you are starting a project from scratch, but sometimes you are in an operational mode where you need to allow dissent even at difficult moments. And people share always the story of the space shuttle Challenger and the O-ring incident. Sometimes dissent will happen at any time, and it could save lives or it could save so many things. So for those who are engaged in a process work, that could be a point. But at sometimes, even after doing all this, when you're operating with something, dissent need to be around the table. Otherwise, life will be lost. Yeah,
I remember hearing a story, and I forget, it was decades ago, essentially on a flight deck of an aeroplane, where a co-pilot was overridden by by the captain, but it was essentially a communication error. The co-pilot was trying to dissent, was trying to say, I don't think you want me to set this bearing or whatever, but did it anyway, and as you say, life was lost. And but I gather the pilots, so that industry now have specific language patterns on how to dissent in emergencies. So it's, you know, even to the point where again, I mean, that's not my industry, but I gather, you know, if the co-pilot thinks a mistake's going to be made, they'll just say, I've got the airplane, and grab the controls, because, you know, it's life is at hand, is at risk there. So yeah, interesting. So I'll tell you what, let's have a quick look at the mural board now. And this is always slightly terrifying because it's on my other screen, so I've not been paying too much attention to what's going on. So hopefully there's some interesting things on there. Let's just share that. Oh, wow. There's, let me just get quite a lot. So we have, gosh, so yeah, so 6 thinking hats. We've got the culture. Apply thinking hats. Someone's found the pentagonal shape. Use dissent to nudge. Make it safe for people to speak up. Ask for specific. Yeah, there's loads of stuff on here, which is fantastic. So great. So we'll keep going. If you didn't join at the very beginning, you might not have seen the link in the chat to that mural board. So I will just pop that in the chat again. So if you aren't currently, and you don't need to log in or anything, it's an open link. So feel free to add thoughts as we go along, and I'll create a PDF of this at the end and share it on LinkedIn as well for those that are present. So okay, so we've covered quite a wide area around dissent. But I know from reading your research that you used a systems dynamics model to simulate the impact of dissent, and that immediately got my attention because that's the sort of thing I really, really enjoy looking at and reading about. But for someone who's never heard of systems dynamics before, what is it, and why would you say it's a useful set of approaches and techniques?
Thank you for asking this question, because it's also close to my heart, and that's the method I use. So system dynamics, in a nutshell, deals with situations that changes over time. It's a dynamic environment where it discovers what people actually want and how different is from what they do. Everybody wants to get better behavior, but maybe what they do don't necessarily lead them to get what they want. It seeks to, I probably needs to say this before, it's a computer simulation. So that seeks to build models to understand the behavior of systems and also improve the policies that improve these systems and their behavior. So that's the goal of that method. What differentiates system dynamics from other modeling and simulation methods is that in addition to using numerical data as inputs to their models, they also use information in databases, in the news, in libraries, and most importantly, the mental models that are in the people's minds. And it allows for all this information to be put explicitly into a simulation model that allows you to explore the problem space and find out what's happening and what's the difference between what you're expecting and what's actually happening. I hope this is a clear explanation of what system dynamics is.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And we've got a question that's come in from Nefra, which it relates to some of the previous parts of the discussion, but it's a really, really, I think, really, really interesting point. And Nefra asks, have you found that people of different cultural backgrounds, so I suppose that could be national cultural backgrounds, for example, accept dissent, so long as it's of a disciplined, impartial type, and embrace it to a greater or lesser degree, depending on their tolerance to directness? Or is it all about setting the tone in the organization and all will follow? So I think that's a really interesting and rich question, Nefra, because what I draw from that is I see perhaps are there certain national cultures that are more open to dissent, or can an organization cultivate a culture where those sorts of things just don't matter? It can be a good dissenting organization irrespective of the person's background and upbringing and so on.
Yeah, that's a great question. And researchers have been looking at this. For example, they had a hypothesis about organizations in democratic societies, maybe more open to dissent versus others. However, even in democratic societies, especially corporate world, is not run by democratic institutions. You know, a company is not run that way. But the discovery was in looking at universities and how they are being managed and how they are designed. And that was one of the oldest institutions that is designed to have dissent. But seeing how, for example, the reputation of universities are not changing over time that much compared to companies, you know, like you can see a company soaring up and maybe in 5 or 10 years, you see them go below. And, you know, when you hear the stories of Enron and others, these are like rock stars at some point. And just a few years later, and if you find there is a whistleblower coming out, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of intimidation and lack of dissent. So it could be an explanation, but it's insufficient to make any conclusive results. And to make it useful, it's interesting that organizations don't necessarily stem their culture from their surroundings. They can be influenced, but they're definitely being influenced by much more factors that can lead us to make any conclusion about that.
Yeah, Araceli asks an interesting follow-up question to that, which is around, and I'm never sure how to pronounce this particular researcher's name. It's either Hofstede or Hofstede or Hofstede. I think, I forget his nationality, but cultural dimensions. So he wrote about different cultural dimensions. And Dutch, thank you. Araceli's just reminded me that he was Dutch. Is there a correlation between those sorts of national cultural dimensions and dissent avoidance? Because, for example, I can't remember all of the cultural dimensions off the top of my head, but I know one of the different dimensions was like uncertainty avoidance. And I wondered whether if a culture is avoiding uncertainty, and if it has a, if its power dimension is such that actually that dissent would be more difficult there, or is it just uncorrelated and unrelated in your view?
To be quite open about this, I am not sure if I can make any conclusion about it. But since we are talking about what are the implications of embracing this view or another, is that if we say that this culture is more inclined to be more tolerant to dissent, and if we make that as a correlation, that, okay, in that culture, because there is more acceptance of dissent, their organizations are more successful.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean we need to find out more? Are all organizations in this particular area or particular culture are all successful because of that reason? Just because I don't have this knowledge, I can't make any conclusive outcome. But what I can say is that even organizations now exist globally, and they're able to enforce their culture wherever they are.
Yeah.
And it became hard for anyone to make that conclusion with the presence of all those dimensions. So
yeah, that makes sense, and it's so true, isn't it? If you look at some of the large organizations that have very strong organizational and corporate cultures, and also I suppose to some extent the globalization and the amount of travel that, that maybe we're all becoming slightly more global anyway. Well, until COVID meant that we could no longer travel.
We can't travel, but we are now traveling much faster with, online.
It's true.
We're meeting so many people in so many different parts of the world that we probably, due to the travel restrictions or, distances, we're seeing them more. But I'd like to add one point, and thank you for bringing that question again to my view, is that, the prevailing view to organizations is mostly the mechanistic view.
Mm-hmm.
And mechanistic views make organizations seem like machines who can operate everywhere. So there is a cultural dimension in organizations when people think about them this way, or like a brain or a culture or even a political system, that could explain the prevalence of dissent or not. But it's limiting it to the culture in the organization, which definitely, as if we think about the organization as an organism that lives in an environment, there are environmental impacts, but they are contextualized among other dimensions. So we can't eliminate it, but there are other factors that can play.
Yeah.
Having a single view to organizations makes us in this dichotomy between like either we are this way or that way. It's more complex than we try to illustrate.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think whenever there are multiple people involved, whenever humans are involved, things start to get very, very complex and complicated. So from your work on dissent, Rafat, I'd be curious, what would your biggest takeaway be, or your biggest piece of advice be?
Just be worried if there are no dissenting views. That's the easiest temperature measurement, if you will, that it's like, I would not call it a COVID test or discovery test, but just be aware. If it looks quiet, it might be so loud that you even can't hear it.
Yeah, it's curious, isn't it? Because I really like that piece of advice, and I think sometimes I've heard people use the expression tacit agreement, like where people agree, but they're not really agreeing; they're just not speaking up. And so, and I know I've certainly had meetings. I suspect many people on connected to this webinar, I've had meetings where things are decided, people walk away and act as if the agreement hadn't happened, because the agreement hasn't really happened. It's just that nobody had you know, no one was brave enough to stand up and say, I disagree. So I guess even at every meeting, it's cultivating ways of enabling people to stand up and say, I disagree.
Yeah, and the second part is asking questions. Leaders have to ask questions rather than talk. And if they, for example, and I bring the De Bono six thinking hats, the last in that sequence, the emotional hat, the red hat, if you will, which is asking people in the room, just checking in, how do you feel about it? You don't need to make it very rational, because sometimes people don't have the rational explanation of why they are silent or why they think it's not going to work. So asking people and being more proactive for them to express is another way of cultivating dissent and making it easier for people to be more expressive about their views.
Which is another really interesting angle, because one thing that I've always put quite a lot of thought into when using the 6 thinking hats is the order. I mean, I always plan an order and then I normally deviate, but I've never really thought about it. Quite often I'll start with red hat to get any initial, sometimes people have stuff bottled up, they just need to get it out. And then I'll finish with red hat. So I'd never really thought that actually, maybe that consciously thinking where to put the red hat is part of cultivating dissent as well, and not being afraid of it. Because it is, as you say, the very definition of the red hat is it doesn't have to be logical. It can just be that someone feels something's really unfair, but it's sort of useful to know that.
One thing that I have learned, and I tried it many times actually. It's the beginning of a meeting or even a seminar or a presentation that I'm going to deliver, is to allow people a few minutes at the beginning to ask questions, right questions that they're expecting from this meeting or from this outcome. And this allows or energizes the room for the beginning. And especially, for example, if you're thinking you're delivering something and they are expecting a totally different thing. And if you uncover this early, that's good for all, because you can adjust and not be surprised by somebody tells you, you wasted our time.
Yeah.
Talking about those who have the courage, or those who don't have the courage and decide just to escape the next meeting or the next presentation. So asking questions early on, or allow people to ask questions, really helps. And it doesn't need to be at the very end. It can also be at the beginning. Yeah. And I credit Hal Gregerson for that technique in his book. I forgot the title of the name. Questions are the answers.
Yeah, and that's setting expectations. So we've probably got time to take one more question. So apologies, folks, if you have asked a question that we haven't addressed. But so we have a question from Araceli again, who asks, what does Rafat think of sociocracy? That's not a topic I'm very familiar with, but I don't know if it's one that you're familiar with, Rafat.
Nope, but I'd like to learn.
Yeah. I know Araceli. She's always on the cutting edge. She's a fantastic person to know and to work with. So, well, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us this evening. I'm absolutely certain that people will want to follow you, find more about your work. What's the best way for people to connect with you?
LinkedIn is a good place to connect. I do have a short article on LinkedIn about dissent. I think it's titled, "If Dissent is Cool, Why Everybody is Not Embracing It," or something. And it has a link to some of my publications in that particular area. I'm also on ResearchGate and others, social media.
Fantastic.
But LinkedIn would be the best.
Fantastic. Well, Rafat, I've just put the link to that article in the chat so that people can click straight through to it now. And the LinkedIn article is relatively short, and it's got the link to some of the more detailed stuff in there. So thank you for that fascinating conversation. I could literally speak to you for hours, Rafat, and I hope we get the chance to speak again. Just before we close, for those of you that are attending live, I do have just a few closing messages and announcements before we formally close. Firstly, there's the next episode of BA Fringe is taking place next week. If you haven't attended BA Fringe before, it is like a live streamed TV show. It's more like TV show format than a webinar. So I've got 4 speakers lined up for that. I have Roger Burlton, who's going to be discussing digital transformation. Alistair Somerville is going to be discussing New Next, breaking our anchor to a weird past for a divergent and vast future. I've seen his contribution already. It's fantastic. Kathy Burkidge is going to be discussing the importance of mindfulness when engaging with tricky stakeholders. And Christina Tan is going to be exploring some key BA trends. Now, I'm just going to paste the details to that into the chat. That one almost always sells out, and there are a limited number of seats in the Zoom room. So do click on register and register if you would like to attend. If you don't register in time, if it fills up, which it almost always does, I will simultaneously broadcast it to YouTube. But if you're on YouTube, you can't do the Zoom chat. I've then got a webinar coming up in March, again with Kathy Burkidge on mindful stakeholder engagement, which is a fascinating topic, and Kathy is a really interesting person as well. So do check those out. The recording from this session will be available in about 24 hours-ish. If you have opted in when you signed up for this webinar, if you've opted in, you'll automatically get that via email. Do feel free to pass that on to anyone who might be interested. I'll also put a link to Rafat's article and LinkedIn profile and so on that email. So with that in mind, all that's left for me to say, again, is a massive thank you, Rafat, for a really fascinating, a really interesting conversation. I feel that this has started a conversation in the business analysis community that will continue for probably forever.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you to your audience and to your community. I appreciate you having me.
Absolutely, and yes, and to echo that, a massive thank you to everyone who is tuning in live and indeed watching the recording. So everyone stay safe and see you again soon, but bye for now. Bye.
Bye.